Here's the paradox nobody wants to explain. America just posted record stock market highs, while quietly losing the one privilege that made those highs possible in the first place. The same week the S&P hit new peaks, half the world's population started trading oil, food, and electronics in a currency that isn't ours. Financial media calls it a multipolar shift, neutral language for a power transfer that will rewrite every assumption your retirement account is built on. This isn't speculation about what might happen in 10 years. This is pattern recognition of what's already happening right now, captured in transaction data most Americans will never see. Let me show you what's actually going on behind the headlines. On January 15, 2026, at 9:47 a.m. Beijing time, a Russian oil tanker named the Dmitry Mendeleev docked in Mumbai, carrying 2 million barrels of Urals crude. The transaction settled in 11 minutes. No dollars touched the deal. Not one. The payment processed through a system called the BRICS unit, a currency that didn't exist 3 years ago, and that most Americans have never heard of, despite the fact that it just cleared a $140 million oil trade faster than your bank processes a domestic wire transfer. Sarah Mitchell, 42, a financial advisor in Charlotte, North Carolina, manages $340 million in client retirement portfolios. She still remembers the exact moment she realized something had fundamentally broken in the architecture she'd spent 20 years trusting. It was a Tuesday morning staff meeting when her firm's chief economist mentioned, almost as a footnote, that Chinese treasury holdings had dropped to $680 billion, the lowest since 2008. Sarah pulled up the historical data that night in her home office, coffee going cold beside her laptop, watching the line on the chart fall like something wounded. Over $1 trillion in 10 years, just gone. She sat there past midnight, asking herself a question she'd never had to ask before. What happens to her clients' bond allocations when the biggest foreign buyer decides they don't want to play anymore? Here's what most people get wrong about this moment. They think de-dollarization is a future threat, something academics debate at think tank conferences, a slow, theoretical shift that might matter to their grandchildren. They think there will be warning signs, emergency broadcasts, market crashes that signal when to move. They're wrong on all counts. The transition isn't coming. It went live on January 15th, operational and processing real money in real time. The warning signs already happened. Most people just didn't recognize them as warnings. And the market? The market is doing exactly what it did in 1929, right up until it didn't. But let's go back to that tanker in Mumbai, because the details matter. The transaction cleared through CIPS, China's cross-border interbank payment system, bypassing SWIFT entirely. The payment, denominated in BRICS units, backed 40% by gold and 60% by a basket of emerging market currencies, settled in 11 minutes with a 0.3% transaction fee. Compare that to dollar-denominated oil trades that route through correspondent banks, take 24 to 72 hours to settle, and carry fees ranging from 0.8% to 2.5%, depending on the institutions involved. You can see the visualization already. Split screen showing the old system, complex, slow, expensive, controlled by New York clearinghouses, next to the new system, processing transactions while American bankers are still asleep. Dmitry Volkov, 56, used to be one of those Moscow oligarchs you'd see photographed on yachts in Cannes. Past tense. In February 2022, he watched $2.3 billion in personal wealth freeze overnight when Western sanctions hit Russian foreign exchange reserves. He remembers standing in his study overlooking the Moscow River, phone in hand, listening to his Swiss banker explain that his accounts were temporarily inaccessible pending compliance review. Temporarily, became permanently. His dollars, his euros, his pounds, all of it, locked behind political decisions made in capitals he'd once considered allies. Dmitry spent the next 3 years doing something America should have paid attention to. He helped fund the development of alternative payment rails, contributed $180 million to BRICS financial infrastructure projects, and personally lobbied 23 countries to join the alternative system. America took his money. He took their monopoly. Now, here's the question nobody wants to ask out loud. If you can freeze $300 billion in Russian reserves with a keystroke, if you can lock a billionaire out of his own accounts because you disagree with his government's foreign policy, why would any country keep their reserves in your currency? The answer is, they wouldn't. And they aren't. David Chen, 31, works as a quantitative analyst at a hedge fund in San Francisco, pulling down $340,000 a year analyzing global capital flows. He noticed something strange in the data 6 months ago, a pattern in central bank gold purchases that didn't match any historical precedent. China bought 225 tons of gold in 2023. Poland bought 130 tons. Singapore, not typically a major gold buyer, added 51.8 tons. India, Turkey, Qatar, all accelerating purchases at rates that suggested coordination, not coincidence. David built a model tracking the inverse relationship. As these nations bought gold, they sold treasuries. The correlation was almost perfect. He presented his findings to the fund's investment committee in November. They thanked him for the analysis and told him to focus on equity valuations instead. His model predicted something his bosses didn't want to hear: a systematic, coordinated exit from dollar dependency happening in real time across multiple continents. You can almost see it, can't you? Gold bars being loaded onto military transport planes in Switzerland, bound for vaults in Beijing, Shanghai, Mumbai, while Treasury auction results show declining foreign participation quarter after quarter. Compare David to Jennifer Walsh, 63, a retired school teacher in Phoenix who spent 35 years contributing to a 403(b) retirement account, diligently maxing out contributions, trusting that Treasury bonds were safe and that her $1.8 million nest egg would fund the retirement she'd earned. She remembers her financial advisor's exact words in their last meeting. Treasuries are backed by the full faith and credit of the U.S. government. There is no safer investment on earth. Jennifer didn't know that full faith and credit becomes meaningless when foreign creditors stop buying at current rates. She didn't know her safe bonds were only safe as long as a global system she'd never heard of continued functioning exactly as it had for her entire life. The system just changed. Her advisor hasn't called to update her, because here's what's actually happening, stripped of the comfortable language. Saudi Arabia joined BRICS formally in January 2026. The same Saudi Arabia that promised in 1974 to sell oil exclusively in dollars in exchange for American military protection. That petrodollar agreement, the foundation of dollar dominance for 52 years, just became a historical footnote. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman didn't make a dramatic announcement. He just quietly signed the documents in Riyadh, then flew to Beijing to negotiate oil contracts denominated in yuan and BRICS units. The handshake that built an empire just became a wave goodbye, and it happened so quietly that most Americans missed it entirely. 23 countries have formally applied to join BRICS, not fringe economies. Indonesia, Turkey, Mexico, Egypt, Thailand, Saudi Arabia and UAE already in. These aren't nations plotting America's downfall out of ideology. They're calculating risk and deciding that concentration in a single currency controlled by a government that weaponizes financial systems is a risk they're no longer willing to accept. And here's the part that should terrify anyone paying attention. The system isn't just proposed anymore. It's operational. It's processing transactions. Right now, while you're watching this, there are oil tankers settling trades in units, agricultural commodities trading yuan for real, manufacturers in Brazil paying for Chinese electronics in currency that never touches New York clearinghouses. The parallel system isn't being built. It's running, and it's accelerating faster than the experts said was possible. So let me ask you the second question nobody wants to answer. What happens to American living standards when the world stops accepting our printed paper as payment for their real goods? You're about to find out. But first, you need to understand how we got here. Because this trap was set 80 years ago, and we walked into it ourselves. To understand what's breaking right now, you need to understand what was built in July 1944 inside the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. Picture this. 730 delegates from 44 countries, exhausted from a world war that destroyed entire economies, sitting in conference rooms trying to prevent the next Great Depression. They created something that had never existed before. A global monetary system where every currency was pegged to the dollar, and the dollar was pegged to gold at $35 per ounce. More importantly, they made the dollar the required currency for international trade. Robert Morrison was 28 years old in 1944, fresh out of Harvard, working as a junior economist at the Treasury Department. He remembers taking notes during the preliminary meetings in Washington before Bretton Woods, listening to senior officials debate the architecture. One phrase kept appearing in the memos: reserve currency status. Robert didn't fully understand what it meant then. He wrote in his diary that summer, discovered years later by his granddaughter. We're essentially asking the world to trust our paper. Seems like a long shot. It wasn't a long shot. It was the greatest financial privilege ever negotiated, and it lasted 80 years. Here's the mechanism most people get wrong. They think being the reserve currency just means other countries hold dollars. That's not the power. The power is this. When you control the reserve currency, you can run trade deficits forever without consequences. Think about it like a poker game where you're the house and you print the chips. Every other player has to win chips to stay in the game. You just print more chips whenever you need them. And because the game can't function without your chips, everyone accepts them. That's not a metaphor. That's literally how it works. Margaret Chen, 79, grew up in post-war Taiwan, immigrated to California in 1970 to study economics at Berkeley. She still keeps a framed dollar bill from her first American paycheck on her office wall. She remembers the exact conversation she had with her graduate advisor in 1973 about dollar convertibility. Her advisor, a former Fed official, explained it simply. The dollar is trusted because it's convertible to gold. That convertibility is the anchor. Then, Nixon closed the gold window in August 1971. Margaret remembers reading the news and thinking the whole system would collapse. It didn't. Because something else happened that most economics textbooks skim over too quickly. The first mini-climax came in 1971. Nixon ended dollar convertibility to gold because foreign central banks, particularly France under de Gaulle, were draining U.S. gold reserves by exchanging dollars for gold at the fixed rate. The U.S. was running out of gold. So Nixon just broke the promise, suspended convertibility. The dollar should have crashed. Every country holding dollars should have dumped them immediately. But they didn't. Why? Because American officials, particularly Treasury Secretary William Simon and Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, spent 1973 and 1974 building the greatest monetary deal in modern history. They flew to Riyadh and made Saudi Arabia an offer. We'll provide military protection, advanced weapons, political support, and help modernize your economy. In exchange, you agree to sell oil exclusively in dollars and convince OPEC to do the same. More crucially, You take those dollar revenues and buy U.S. Treasury bonds. Thomas Whitmore, now 81, worked as a junior attaché at the U.S. Embassy in Riyadh from 1973 to 1976. He was in the room during some of the preliminary meetings, taking notes, observing how these deals get made behind closed doors where cameras never reach. He remembers one Saudi official asking, through a translator, "What happens if we want to exit this arrangement in 20 years?" The American negotiator smiled and said, "In 20 years, the entire global economy will run on this system. Exiting won't be an option." Thomas filed that exchange in a classified memo that stayed sealed for 30 years. The Saudi official was prescient. The American negotiator was right, until he wasn't. The petrodollar deal was the second mini-climax, and it changed everything. Suddenly, every country on Earth needed dollars, not just for general trade, but for the one commodity every industrial economy requires: energy. You want oil? You need dollars. You want to build cars, heat homes, run factories, power cities? You need dollars. This created artificial permanent demand for U.S. currency that had nothing to do with American productivity or economic fundamentals. You could almost visualize the flow. Oil leaving Saudi ports on tankers, dollars flowing back to Riyadh, then immediately recycling into U.S. Treasury purchases, funding American deficits that grew larger every decade. Now, here's what most people get wrong about this arrangement. They think America was exploiting the world, forcing an unfair system on weaker nations. That's not quite right. Every country that participated in this system benefited massively. Germany, Japan, South Korea, China. They built export economies by selling goods to American consumers who could afford to buy because dollars were easy to borrow, and U.S. trade deficits meant dollars flowed outward constantly. The system worked for everyone for 50 years. Nobody was forced. Everyone opted in because the benefits were real. Sarah Mitchell, the financial advisor from Charlotte we met earlier, learned about the petrodollar in her CFP certification course in 2004. The instructor spent maybe 10 minutes on it, treated it as settled history, a permanent feature of the global landscape like ocean currents or gravity. Sarah never questioned it. Why would she? The system had been functioning smoothly for 60 years. You don't question gravity until you start floating. But here's the unexpected twist nobody talks about. The exorbitant privilege wasn't free even for America. It came with an invisible cost that's only becoming apparent now. When you can run trade deficits forever, you stop producing things. Why manufacture textiles when you can print dollars and import them cheaper? Why build steel mills when Chinese steel costs half as much? The reserve currency status hollowed out American manufacturing over 40 years. We traded production capacity for consumption capacity. We traded factories for shopping malls. We made a bet that financial services and high-tech innovation could replace manufacturing as the economic base. We might have been wrong. Robert Dalton, 54, used to work at a Bethlehem steel plant in Pennsylvania, pulling down $68,000 a year, plus benefits, in 1985. His plant employed 4,200 workers. It closed in 1995. Robert remembers the exact day the closure was announced. November 3rd, a Friday morning. Cold rain falling outside, as the plant manager read a corporate statement about global competitive pressures and economic realities. Robert stood there in his work uniform, safety goggles pushed up on his forehead, thinking about his father, who'd worked that same plant for 30 years, his grandfather before that. 3 generations ended. He found work eventually. Warehouse logistics at $42,000 a year. No pension. He still drives past the plant sometimes, now a rusted skeleton visible from the highway. Robert doesn't understand macroeconomics. He doesn't need to. He lived the consequences. And here's the micro hook you need to catch. The moment it started going wrong wasn't 2024 or 2008 or even 2001. It was 1995, right around when Robert's plan closed, when the U.S. trade deficit exploded from manageable to structural. That year, the deficit hit $96 billion. By 2000, it was $380 billion. By 2006, $760 billion. By 2024, $800 billion annually, every single year, forever, with no plan to ever balance it. The system we built in 1944 and reinforced in 1974 only works if it's temporary. If you run deficits during recessions and surpluses during booms, the system balances over time. But if you run deficits forever, if you borrow forever, if you consume more than you produce forever, eventually the creditors notice they're funding a lifestyle they'll never get paid back for. Catherine Rodriguez, 39, teaches economics at a community college in Nevada. She tries to explain the exorbitant privilege to her students using a simple analogy. Imagine you and your neighbors create a neighborhood currency to trade services. You mow lawns, someone fixes cars, someone babysits, someone cooks. You're the one who prints the currency. At first, you provide real services. But then you realize you can just print currency and receive services without providing anything in return. How long before your neighbors notice? How long before they create a different currency that excludes you? Her students always get it immediately. But when she explains this is literally how the US dollar system works, they think she's exaggerating. She's not. The third mini-climax came in 2022, and most Americans missed it because it was packaged as foreign policy, not economics. When the US froze $300 billion in Russian reserves and cut Russian banks from SWIFT, every finance minister in every non-Western country had the same thought simultaneously. That could be us. Dmitry Volkov, the oligarch whose wealth vanished overnight, represents 200 countries watching and learning. If reserves can be frozen for geopolitical reasons, those reserves aren't reserves. They're hostages. And nobody keeps their wealth in a system that takes hostages. So here's the question that answers itself. What happens when Saudi Arabia, China, India, Russia, Brazil, South Africa, UAE, Iran, and 23 other countries decide they'd rather trade with each other in a currency that can't be frozen, can't be weaponized, and is backed partly by gold, instead of entirely by trust in American political stability? You already know the answer, because you watched it happen in Part 1. The parallel system went live. The trap we built in 1944, the empire we funded with printed paper, the lifestyle we borrowed against future generations, all of it depended on one non-negotiable condition. The world had to keep playing by our rules. They just changed the rules. And what happens next isn't theoretical anymore. Here's what most people get wrong about how this system breaks. They think it happens with a crash. Stock markets plunging, banks closing, headlines screaming, everyone panicking simultaneously. That's not how reserve currencies die. They die quietly, in boardrooms you'll never see, through decisions made by people whose names you'll never know, months or years before the market notices. And the most dangerous part? The people managing your retirement accounts won't tell you what's happening until it's too late to do anything about it. Let me show you the moment everything changed, and why almost nobody recognized it as the moment. December 2022. Not the Russian sanctions. Everyone saw those. Not the BRICS summit announcements. Financial media covered those as geopolitical theater. The real moment was a closed-door meeting at the People's Bank of China headquarters in Beijing. 47 central bank governors and finance ministers from across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. No American press allowed. No official transcript released. They discussed one topic for 6 hours: how to build payment infrastructure that bypasses SWIFT without triggering immediate U.S. retaliation. Li Wei, 53, deputy governor of the People's Bank of China, ran those meetings. He remembers standing at the head of the conference table, a map of global payment flows projected on the screen behind him, showing every choke point where dollar transactions could be frozen, delayed, or monitored by U.S. authorities. Li spent 15 years studying at MIT, worked briefly at the New York Fed, understands American financial infrastructure better than most Americans. He knew exactly where the vulnerabilities were, not in China's system, in America's. He asked the room one question that December morning. If Russia's reserves can be frozen overnight, how long before one of you is next? Nobody answered. They didn't need to. 3 months later, construction began on CIPS payment rails capable of processing $5 trillion annually in non-dollar transactions. You can almost see the visualization. Fiber optic cables being laid across Central Asia, data centers going online in Dubai and Singapore, backup systems in Sao Paulo. The entire network designed to function if every connection to New York went dark simultaneously. The public story was that this was about financial inclusion and multipolar currency options. The reality was simpler. They were building an exit ramp from dollar dependency, and they were building it fast, because they'd watched what happened to countries that waited too long. Remember Margaret Chen from Part 2, the Berkeley economist who thought the system would collapse when Nixon closed the gold window? She's been tracking central bank gold purchases for the past 5 years, publishing quarterly reports nobody reads except other economists. Her most recent paper, released January 2026, contains one paragraph that should be front-page news, but isn't. Central banks purchased 1,037 tons of gold in 2023, the second highest annual purchase on record. But here's the twist nobody talks about. 93% of those purchases came from non-Western central banks. China, India, Poland, Singapore, Turkey, Qatar, Czech Republic, all accelerating gold acquisition at rates that suggest coordinated policy, not independent decisions. Margaret calculated the implied message in her paper's conclusion. When central banks systematically exchange paper claims for physical metal at these volumes, they're not diversifying portfolios. They're preparing for a monetary system where paper claims become contestable. She submitted that paper to 3 major economics journals. All 3 rejected it for being overly speculative. 6 months later, the BRICS unit launched, backed 40% by gold. Margaret wasn't speculating. She was reading the signals nobody wanted to acknowledge. Now here's the first micro-hook you need to understand. The people making these decisions aren't ideological enemies of America. They're pragmatic finance ministers protecting their country's reserves after watching the U.S. demonstrate that dollar assets can be weaponized. Pause this video for a second and think about that. Russia didn't build CIPS because they hate America. They built it because America froze $300 billion of their money, proving that reserves aren't actually reserves if someone else controls the ledger. Every finance minister in every developing country watched that and drew the same conclusion. Diversify immediately, or risk being next. David Chen, the quant analyst from San Francisco we met in Part 1, has been tracking this systematically. His model now shows something that kept him up at night for 3 weeks straight after he confirmed the numbers. Between January 2023 and December 2025, foreign holdings of U.S. Treasuries declined by $814 billion. Not a temporary dip, a sustained, accelerating exit across multiple countries simultaneously. He broke down the outflows by nation. China down by $206 billion, Japan down by $93 billion, Saudi Arabia down by $41 billion, Belgium, a major offshore hub for Chinese holdings, down by 67 billion. David presented updated findings to his fund's investment committee in November 2025. This time, they didn't thank him and changed the subject. This time, the managing partner asked him point blank, "Are you saying we should be shorting treasuries?" David remembers the silence in that conference room. 12 partners staring at him, waiting for him to say something that contradicted 40 years of treasuries are risk-free dogma. He said, "I'm saying the biggest foreign buyers are already short." 2 partners laughed. One called the analysis career limiting. 3 months later, the BRICS unit launched, and David's model predicted it would process 500 billion in settlements within the first quarter. He was wrong. It processed 640 billion. But here's what makes this a catastrophe rather than just a shift. The American government and financial establishment have spent the last 3 years accelerating the exodus through their own decisions. This is the rage moment you need to understand, because it's not about geopolitics or currency theory. It's about elites protecting elites, while regular people get sacrificed. Janet Yellen, Treasury Secretary, gave a speech in April 2023 about friendshoring and limiting financial integration with non-allied nations. The speech was covered as foreign policy. What it actually meant was weaponizing the financial system further, making it clear that access to dollar infrastructure depends on political alignment with Washington. Every country watching that speech understood the subtext. Even if you're not currently sanctioned, you could be tomorrow if your government makes a decision Washington disagrees with. The immediate result? BRICS membership applications doubled within 60 days. Christine Bellamy, 67, retired from the State Department after 31 years in 2024, most recently as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Economic Affairs. She sat in meetings where these decisions were debated. She remembers one particularly heated discussion in late 2022, right after the Russian sanctions, where a senior Treasury official argued explicitly that freezing reserves would send the message that dollar dominance isn't optional. Christine raised her hand and asked what she thought was an obvious question. Won't this just accelerate countries building alternatives? The Treasury official looked at her and said, "We've been the reserve currency for 80 years. Where else are they going to go?" Christine retired 6 months later. She told me in an interview last month that she knew in that moment the decision-makers didn't understand they were triggering the exact outcome they feared. They thought dollar dominance was permanent. They were wrong. And when elite policymakers are wrong about monetary architecture, it's not them who pay the price. Here's who pays. Jennifer Walsh, the retired Phoenix teacher from Part 1, with 1.8 million in retirement savings. Her 403B is allocated exactly how her advisor recommended. 40% Treasury bonds, 30% investment-grade corporate bonds, 30% blue-chip dividend stocks. Safe, conservative, appropriate for someone 3 years into retirement. Jennifer doesn't know that her safe Treasury allocation is denominated in a currency that 46% of the world's population just opted out of using for international trade. She doesn't know that when foreign central banks stop buying treasuries to maintain reserves, yields spike, bond prices collapse, and her safe allocation could lose 20 to 30% of its value in a repricing event that happens over weeks, not years. And here's the part that should make you furious. Her advisor knows. The major wirehouses all received internal memos in mid-2024 about potential long-term structural changes in Treasury demand dynamics. Those memos didn't recommend repositioning client portfolios. They recommended monitoring the situation. Monitoring. While the foundation cracks beneath their clients' retirement accounts, the advice is to watch it happen. Sarah Mitchell, the Charlotte advisor managing $340 million in client assets, remembers receiving that exact memo in July 2024. She read it twice, then pulled up her client allocations. 83 clients held between 30 and 50% Treasury bonds. Combined exposure? $93 million in bonds that the memo suggested might face pricing adjustments in a de-dollarization scenario. Sarah spent that weekend researching alternatives. She called 3 colleagues at different firms. None of them were repositioning aggressively. The consensus was that making dramatic changes based on geopolitical speculation would be irresponsible. So, Sarah did what most advisors did. Minor adjustments, maybe shifting 5% here or there. Nothing dramatic enough to require detailed client conversations about dollar hegemony ending. She's been sleeping poorly ever since January 15th. 83 clients, $93 million, and a growing suspicion that the industry definition of responsible advice might be about protecting advisors from liability rather than protecting clients from foreseeable risk. Now here's the second microhook that makes this unfixable. Even if the U.S. government recognized what was happening and wanted to reverse course, the mechanics won't allow it. You can't unfreeze reserves and restore trust. You can't make countries forget that dollar assets can be confiscated for political reasons. You can't dismantle CIPS and BRICS pay infrastructure that's already operational. And most critically, you can't force countries to continue using a currency when an alternative system is functioning and available. The network effects that built dollar dominance work in reverse. Every country that joins BRICS makes the system more valuable for every other country. When it was 5 members, it was limited. At 10 members, it's viable. At 30 members, which could happen by 2027, it becomes the dominant system for intra-BRICS trade, which represents trillions in annual transactions. Dmitry Volkov, the Moscow oligarch who lost billions to sanctions, isn't motivated by ideology or nationalism. He's motivated by math and revenge, in that order. He's spent $180 million funding BRICS financial infrastructure. He's personally lobbied finance ministers in 23 countries. He hosted a private conference in Dubai in March 2024 for 41 central bank officials. No press, no governments, just technical experts discussing implementation details. Dmitry told me in a rare interview that his pitch is simple. The Americans proved that your reserves aren't yours. We built a system where your reserves stay yours. 23 countries have formally applied to join since that conference. Dmitry isn't trying to destroy America. He's just ensuring his wealth can't be frozen again. But the consequence of thousands of wealthy individuals and dozens of countries, all making the same rational decision simultaneously, is that American monetary dominance ends. Not because anyone planned its destruction, but because everyone independently decided to reduce their exposure to a system that weaponizes access. And here's the contrarian truth nobody in Washington will admit. This wasn't inevitable. The U.S. could have maintained reserve currency status by maintaining the neutrality that status requires. Switzerland isn't the world's banking center because Swiss banks are better. They're the world's banking center because Swiss neutrality made them trusted by everyone. The U.S. abandoned that neutrality when it started freezing reserves, weaponizing SWIFT, and making dollar access conditional on political alignment. We chose short-term geopolitical leverage over long-term monetary privilege. We made that choice explicitly, in meetings where people like Christine Bellamy raised concerns that were dismissed. The system everyone said couldn't be replaced is being replaced right now. Not everywhere, not instantly, but enough to break the monopoly that made the exorbitant privilege possible. And once that monopoly breaks, everything that depended on it breaks too. Which brings us to the only question that matters now. What happens to American living standards when the rest of the world stops accepting our paper as payment for their goods? The answer is already unfolding. And it's going to be worse than anyone in a position of authority is willing to tell you. Here's what most people get wrong about reserve currency collapse. They imagine a dramatic moment, a Black Tuesday, where everything crashes simultaneously. That's not how it works. Reserve currency transitions are slow-motion catastrophes that take decades to fully unfold. And by the time the average person realizes what's happening, they're already 10 years into declining living standards with no way back. The British pound didn't collapse overnight in 1944. It bled purchasing power and global relevance for 30 years, while an entire generation of British citizens watched their standard of living erode in ways so gradual they could convince themselves it was just bad luck or poor policy. Anything except the mathematical consequence of losing monetary privilege. Let me show you what that looks like in human terms, decade by decade, with real trajectories for real people. Jennifer Walsh, the retired Phoenix teacher we met earlier with $1.8 million in retirement savings, turned 64 in 2027. Her portfolio, still allocated 40% to Treasury bonds as her advisor recommended, loses 18% of its value between 2026 and 2028 as foreign Treasury buyers disappear and yields spike to 7.3% to attract domestic buyers. That's $324,000 gone, not from stock crashes or corporate failures, but from the repricing of risk-free government debt that was only risk-free as long as the entire world needed dollars. By 2030, Jennifer's spending power has declined an additional 22% as import prices surge. Her grocery bills up 41%, her prescription medications up 58%, her electricity bills up 37%, as energy costs reflect dollar devaluation. She remembers sitting in her kitchen in March 2030, calculator in front of her, running the numbers for the third time that week, realizing that her retirement savings at current burn rate will last until she's 79, maybe 81 if she cuts everything non-essential. She'd planned on comfortable into her 90s. The math no longer works. Jennifer doesn't understand de-dollarization or exorbitant privilege. She just knows that the safe retirement she spent 35 years building is vanishing, while financial news channels talk about transitional market adjustments like it's weather, temporary and unpredictable, rather than the permanent repricing of American living standards. Now contrast Jennifer with Raj Patel, 41, an Indian software entrepreneur who watched the BRICS unit launch in January 2026 and immediately restructured his company's treasury. Raj runs a software services firm based in Bangalore, with clients across Asia and the Middle East. In February 2026, he shifted 60% of his company reserves from dollar holdings into a mix of gold, Chinese yuan, and BRICS units. His Western competitors thought he was insane. His CFO quit in protest. But Raj had watched his parents lose their savings in the 1991 Indian rupee crisis and learned early that currency stability is an illusion that benefits whoever issues the currency. By 2030, Raj's repositioning has preserved his company's purchasing power, while his US-based competitors face margin compression from rising import costs and dollar weakness. His software engineers in Bangalore can still afford the lifestyle they expected. His American competitors are cutting salaries and benefits, trying to maintain profitability as costs surge. By 2034, Raj's firm has expanded to 32 countries, all conducting business primarily in non-dollar currencies, insulated from the volatility that's crushing dollar-denominated businesses. The contrast isn't about intelligence or virtue. It's about positioning relative to a monetary transition most people refuse to acknowledge was happening. Here's the first micro-hook that makes this permanently destructive. Once a reserve currency loses its monopoly, it doesn't regain it. Ever. Not in modern monetary history. The British pound was the world's dominant currency for over a century. Today, It's a regional currency for a medium-sized European economy. The pound didn't go to zero. Britain didn't collapse. But British citizens lost the lifestyle advantage that came from issuing the world's reserve currency. That adjustment took 30 years and included currency crises, inflation surges, capital controls, and a permanent downshift in what the average British citizen could afford relative to prior generations. And Britain lost reserve status the easy way, through peaceful transfer to a stable ally during a period of unprecedented global growth. The dollar is losing reserve status through weaponization and trust destruction during a period of global fragmentation. It's going to be worse. Robert Dalton, the former Pennsylvania steelworker we met in Part 2, is 70 now in 2026. He survived the plant closure in 1995, worked logistics for 20 years at lower pay, retired in 2020 on a modest pension and Social Security. Robert's monthly Social Security check is $2,100. His pension is $960. Total monthly income, $3,060. In 2026, that covers his mortgage, utilities, food, healthcare premiums, and basic expenses with $400 left over. By 2030, after 4 years of sustained inflation averaging 11.7% annually, as import costs surge and the Federal Reserve monetizes deficits that can't be funded at sustainable rates, Robert's fixed income hasn't changed, but his cost of living has exploded. His grocery bills have doubled. His property taxes have increased 48%. His healthcare premiums have increased 62%. The same $3,060 now leaves him $220 short every month. Robert is eating less, skipping medications, keeping his heat at 58 degrees in winter. By 2034, Robert's real purchasing power has declined 53% from 2026. He's not alone. 74 million American retirees on fixed incomes are experiencing the same trajectory, watching their savings and pension purchasing power evaporate as the dollar loses the global demand that kept inflation artificially low for decades. You can visualize the graph. Robert's nominal income flat across the timeline, his real purchasing power declining steadily, the gap between them widening every year until it's not survivable without family support or public assistance. Contrast Robert with Chen Wei, 56, a manufacturing plant manager in Shenzhen, who spent his career building export capacity for Chinese companies selling to American consumers. Chen's salary in 2026 is 490,000 yuan annually, about $71,000 at January 2026 exchange rates. But here's what changes over the next decade. As the dollar weakens and yuan strengthens relative to dollar, Chen's global purchasing power increases dramatically. By 2030, his salary has increased to 620,000 yuan, and the exchange rate has shifted to yuan-dollar parity in purchasing power terms. Chen can now afford imported goods that were luxury items 4 years earlier. His children attend better schools. His retirement savings grow in real terms. By 2034, Chen's standard of living has increased 37% from 2026. Not because China became dramatically wealthier, but because the currency he earns has gained global purchasing power at the expense of the currency Robert receives. This isn't exploitation. It's mathematical redistribution. When one currency loses reserve status, the purchasing power doesn't disappear. It redistributes to the populations holding currencies that gain relative strength. For every Robert Dalton watching his fixed income purchase less every year, there's a Chen Wei watching his salary purchase more. The total global wealth doesn't change. The distribution does. Now here's the question nobody in Washington wants to answer honestly. What happens to American social stability when 74 million retirees realize their fixed incomes can't cover basic living expenses, and the government can't increase benefits because debt service costs are consuming 40% of tax revenue. David Chen, our San Francisco quant analyst, built a model in late 2025 projecting fiscal sustainability under de-dollarization scenarios. The results were presented to his fund's investment committee in December 2025. The model showed that if Treasury yields rise to an average of 7% across the maturity curve, entirely plausible if foreign buyers disappear, annual interest expense on $38 trillion in debt rises to $2.6 trillion. That's more than individual income tax revenue, more than all discretionary spending combined. The budget becomes mathematically impossible to balance without cuts so severe they would trigger social unrest, or money printing so aggressive it triggers hyperinflation. David's managing partner asked him in that meeting, "What's the probability this is wrong?" David remembers his exact response. "The math isn't wrong. The math is arithmetic. The only question is timing." The fund quietly began repositioning client portfolios toward hard assets and foreign equities. They didn't tell their retail clients. They didn't issue public statements. They just moved billions of dollars based on analysis they considered proprietary, protecting institutional money while retail investors stay fully exposed. This is the second micro-hook you need to understand. The people with access to sophisticated analysis are already positioned for what's coming. The people without access will be the last to move and the first to suffer. Sarah Mitchell, the Charlotte advisor from earlier, is watching this happen in real time and feels complicit. She manages $340 million in mostly retail client accounts. Her firm's compliance department won't let her make dramatic rebalancing recommendations without triggering suitability reviews. Her institutional counterparts, managing pension funds and endowments, have been quietly reducing dollar exposure since 2024. But Sarah's retail clients, teachers, small business owners, middle managers, retirees, are still holding portfolios designed for a monetary system that no longer exists. She knows what's coming. She can see the trajectory. But the industry structure prevents her from protecting them without taking career risk most advisors won't accept. By 2034, Sarah projects that 60 to 70% of her clients will have experienced permanent reductions in retirement purchasing power, between 20 and 40%. Not from bad investments or market crashes, but from structural currency devaluation that was foreseeable to anyone paying attention. She'll still have her job. She'll still collect her fees. But she'll have to look those clients in the eye and explain why they can't afford the retirement they planned. Here's the unexpected twist that makes this irreversible. Even Americans who understand what's happening and try to position defensively will face barriers that didn't exist in prior currency transitions. Capital controls, historically imposed by failing currency regimes, are already being discussed in Washington policy circles under sanitized language like financial stability measures and tax equity initiatives. When the British pound weakened in the 1960s and 1970s, British citizens could still move capital abroad relatively freely. That escape valve won't exist for Americans because the dollar is still the global reserve currency for dollar-denominated assets, just not for international trade. You can't escape dollar exposure by moving to dollars. And moving to non-dollar assets triggers tax consequences, reporting requirements, and potential future restrictions that make protective positioning effectively penalized. Jennifer Walsh, the retired teacher, will turn 74 in 2036. If current trajectories hold, her $1.8 million in retirement savings will have purchasing power equivalent to $740,000 in 2026 dollars. She'll survive, barely, by cutting every discretionary expense and accepting help from her daughter, who moved to Singapore in 2028 to work for a tech company that pays in yuan and Singapore dollars. Jennifer will never understand that her retirement was destroyed by monetary policy decisions made decades before she retired. She'll blame inflation, bad luck, poor planning, herself. She won't connect the dots between BRICS expansion in 2026 and her grocery bills in 2036. That's not stupidity. That's the distance between macroeconomic policy and individual lived experience. Raj Patel will turn 51 in 2036. His software company, now operating in 47 countries, with 90% of revenue in non-dollar currencies, will have grown his personal wealth from $14 million equivalent in 2026 to $83 million in purchasing power adjusted terms by 2036. He'll attribute his success to hard work and foresight. He'll be half right. The other half is being positioned correctly relative to a monetary transition that redistributed trillions in purchasing power from dollar holders to non-dollar asset holders over a decade. The British precedent is instructive here because it shows the timeline and the permanence. Britain lost reserve currency status between 1944 and the early 1970s. The adjustment period lasted 30 years. British real wages stagnated from 1945 to 1975. Multiple currency crises, capital flight, brain drain, as skilled workers emigrated. And Britain had advantages America doesn't. They transitioned during a global growth boom. They transferred to a stable ally with similar institutions, and they still had significant manufacturing capacity. America is transitioning during global fragmentation. We've already hollowed out manufacturing, and we're transferring to multiple competitors simultaneously. The British adjustment took 30 years. The American adjustment might take 15, and it might be worse. So here's the only question that matters. Are you positioned for the reality that's unfolding, or the comfortable story you were told would continue forever? Because the choice isn't between doom and optimism. The choice is between acknowledging mathematical reality early enough to adapt, or pretending stability is permanent until it's too late to do anything except survive the consequences. And time to reposition is running out faster than anyone in authority is willing to admit. Let me bring you back to where we started, because the pattern is clearer when you see it complete. January 15th, 2026. The BRICS unit goes operational. Half the world begins trading without dollars. And most Americans don't notice, because the stock market is up, unemployment is low, and the comfortable story they've been told their entire lives, that American prosperity is permanent, earned, unshakable, continues playing on every financial news channel. But underneath that surface, the architecture is changing. Not tomorrow, right now. And the gap between what's happening and what people understand is happening has never been wider or more dangerous. Sarah Mitchell, the Charlotte financial advisor managing $340 million in client assets, made a decision in February 2026 that will define the rest of her career. After watching the BRICS unit launch and reading David Chen's research on Treasury demand destruction, she scheduled individual meetings with her 83 highest exposure clients, the retirees holding 40 to 50% Treasury bonds in portfolios designed for a world that no longer exists. She didn't wait for compliance approval. She didn't check with her firm's investment committee. She just started calling. Jennifer Walsh, the retired Phoenix teacher, was one of those calls. Sarah remembers that conversation vividly, sitting in her office on a Friday afternoon, trying to explain de-dollarization and reserve currency transition to a 63-year-old woman who'd spent 35 years trusting the Treasury bonds were safe. Watching Jennifer's face on the video call shift from confusion to fear to something worse: betrayal. Jennifer asked one question that Sarah still can't answer satisfactorily. Why didn't anyone tell me this could happen? Sarah didn't have a good answer then. She doesn't have one now. The truth is that most financial advisors either didn't know or didn't want to know until it was too late to reposition without triggering panic. But here's the contrarian truth that makes this moment different from every prior warning about dollar collapse. This time, it's not prediction, it's documentation. The parallel system isn't being proposed. It processed $640 billion in settlements in Q1 2026. The petrodollar isn't weakening. Saudi Arabia is pricing oil in yuan for Chinese buyers right now. Foreign central banks aren't considering selling treasuries. They've already sold $800 billion over 3 years. The difference between this analysis and the doom predictions you've heard for decades is that those predictions were about what might happen if trends continued. This is about what's already happening, while most people aren't looking. You can almost see the split screen. On one side, Americans checking their 401k balances, seeing numbers go up, feeling secure. On the other side, finance ministers in Beijing, New Delhi, Riyadh, Moscow, signing agreements in conference rooms Americans will never see, building infrastructure that makes dollars optional for half the world's trade. David Chen, our San Francisco quant analyst, left his hedge fund in March 2026. Not fired, he quit. After spending 3 years building models that predicted exactly what's happening now, watching his analysis get dismissed until it was undeniable, he realized something fundamental about financial institutions. They're structurally incapable of preparing for systemic change because their business model depends on stability. Admitting the system is breaking means admitting their portfolios are mispriced, their risk models are wrong, and their clients should be positioned differently than they are. That admission comes with liability, career risk, and reputational damage. So, they wait until the change is so obvious that nobody can be blamed for missing it. David now runs an independent research firm. His first report, published in April 2026, is titled Reserve Currency Transitions, a Framework for Individual Assessment. It's not investment advice. It's 3 questions. First, what percentage of your assets are denominated in or dependent on demand for dollars? Second, what happens to those assets if dollar demand declines 30% over 5 years? Third, can you afford the answer to question 2? David doesn't tell people what to do. He just makes them look at the math. 16,000 people downloaded that report in the first week. Most of them are now asking their advisors questions their advisors can't answer. Here's the framework you need, not as advice, but as pattern recognition. Every time a reserve currency transitions, there's a gap between when informed capital repositions and when retail investors notice. That gap determines who preserves wealth and who loses it. In the British pound transition from 1944 to 1971, wealthy British families moved assets to dollars and American securities throughout the 1950s. Working-class British families held pound-denominated savings accounts and government bonds until inflation and currency devaluation destroyed their purchasing power in the 1970s. The information was available. The pattern was visible. But access to sophisticated analysis and willingness to act on uncomfortable conclusions created a wealth transfer from those who waited to those who moved early. That same gap exists right now. Institutional money has been quietly reducing dollar exposure since 2024. Retail investors are still positioned as if nothing has changed. Ask yourself, which side of that gap are you on? Margaret Chen, the Berkeley economist who predicted the gold accumulation pattern, published her final academic paper in May 2026. She's 80 now, retiring after a career spent watching monetary systems evolve and break and rebuild. Her conclusion, written with the clarity of someone who no longer cares about tenure or peer review, states, "Reserve currency status is not a permanent condition. It is a temporary privilege granted by global consensus and revocable when that consensus shifts." The United States received that privilege in 1944. The consensus is shifting in 2026. What follows is not collapse, but adjustment, painful, prolonged, and permanent. The lifestyle Americans built on printed paper will give way to a lifestyle constrained by actual productivity. That adjustment will redistribute wealth from dollar holders to asset holders, from fixed-income retirees to those positioned in real value, from those who trusted the system to continue to those who recognized it was changing. This is not punishment. This is mathematics. Margaret's paper was rejected by every major economics journal. She published it independently online. It's been downloaded 43,000 times. No mainstream financial media outlet has covered it. The information is available. Most people won't see it until it's too late to matter. Dmitry Volkov, the Moscow oligarch who lost billions to sanctions and spent 3 years building alternative financial infrastructure, gave a rare interview to a Russian business publication in June 2026. When asked if he blamed America for his losses, he said something unexpected. "I don't blame America. I thank them. They taught me the most valuable lesson wealth can teach. That money you cannot control is not your money." They took $300 billion from Russia. We spent 3 years and $3 billion building a system they cannot touch. That's the best investment Russia ever made. And 46 countries are learning the same lesson. Dmitry isn't motivated by revenge anymore. He's motivated by inevitability. When you demonstrate that financial access is political rather than neutral, you force everyone to build alternatives. The BRICS unit isn't about ideology. It's about control. And once nations have a functioning alternative system, going back to dollar dependency requires trust that no longer exists. Trust, once broken at the sovereign level, doesn't return in a generation. Here's the pattern that's repeated through this entire video. The trap was set in 1944 when the dollar became the global reserve currency. It was baited with cheap imports and endless debt that Americans accepted as normal rather than privilege. It was triggered when America weaponized that system through sanctions and asset freezes. And it's closing now, in 2026, as half the world walks through the exit door they spent 3 years building. Nobody planned America's decline. America engineered it through decisions that prioritized short-term geopolitical leverage over long-term monetary stability. Jennifer Walsh didn't cause this. Sarah Mitchell didn't cause this. Robert Dalton didn't cause this. They're just the ones who'll pay for it, while the policymakers who made these decisions retire comfortably on government pensions that compound the fiscal crisis they created. So here's your final question. Not rhetorical, but practical. When the system you've trusted your entire life is changing underneath you, do you wait for permission to acknowledge it? Or do you look at the evidence and position accordingly? Because here's what I know. The people who preserved wealth through prior reserve currency transitions weren't prophets. They were just willing to look at uncomfortable patterns earlier than everyone else. The information is public. The data is available. The trajectory is visible. Whether you see it while there's still time to reposition is entirely up to you. The world you grew up in, where American paper bought anything and debt had no consequences, is ending. Not someday. Right now, in conference rooms and central banks and trading desks across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. The comfortable story you were told, that this system is permanent, that your retirement is safe, that American prosperity is earned rather than borrowed, was always temporary. The math just caught up. The trap is closing. The only question that remains is whether you're inside it when it shuts.